All right, so we'll finish up the War of 1812 now. Okay, so in the eastern side of the War of 1812, there was a turning point at a place called Plattsburgh. So the British were having some success in Washington, D.C. and Baltimore, although they were held off at Baltimore for some time. The British General George Prevost led about 10,000 troops. That's pretty many. South from Canada with the objective to capture Plattsburgh on the shore of Lake Champlain in New York. And you can see that that's just, Lake Champlain extends a little bit up into Canada, so it's just right there for them. Okay, it was a good idea, but there was an American naval force there that defeated the British and they had to retreat back into Canada, which makes them look really pretty bad because they're supposed to have the best navy on the planet, and yet our little navy happened to push them back. And it was this battle that kind of helped the British be convinced that, this really wasn't worth their time. It really wasn't, because what were the Americans upset with? Well, they wanted them out of their forts. They wanted them to stop impressing their sailors, and the British had already decided they were going to stop that of their own accord. So maybe it wasn't worth carrying on this fight after all. So with that, you get the end of the war. In December 1814, American and British people met up in Ghent, Belgium. That's why it's called the Treaty of Ghent. Remember, treaties are named for whatever city the people gather up to sign them in, okay? Britain promises to get out of the Ohio River Valley, finally. There's an agreement to demilitarize the Great Lakes by both sides, meaning that they're not going to have, the British isn't going to keep their Royal Navy ships on the Great Lakes, and the United States is not going to keep their military vessels on the Great Lakes in order to keep the peace. They agree to share the Great Lakes, to use them for transportation and fishing and whatever, but to use them equally, but to share them. Okay, the U.S. still retains its fishing rights off the coast of Nova Scotia, which is important to the United States because that's really, really good, rich fishing grounds, and it still is. One of the most important battles of the entire war happened after the war was over, the Battle of New Orleans. It happened on January 8th, 1815. And the British, on their part, they don't know the war is over because, communication is not the best. And Andrew Jackson had been working in the South, and he's got his guys down there in New Orleans, and he's like, well, the British are coming. I'm not Paul Revere, but it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure that out. I mean, there weren't any rocket scientists, but he knew what was going on. And he knew he had to hold New Orleans because the British didn't realize the war was over either. They both keep on fighting. And Jackson puts together, he doesn't have that many soldiers, but he puts together a coalition of his own soldiers, the pirates that were there on the coast. They don't want the British to win either. Civilians from New Orleans who are willing to take up a gun and fight against the British. Native Americans who are, now let's see, Jackson has put the smackdown on the Creeks. So some Native Americans don't like him, but there are other Native American tribes that are friendly with him. And some Native Americans join up with him, and even some slaves will join up to help him turn back the British. They're outnumbered. If you look at the numbers on that last bullet point, American forces 4,732, British forces 11,000. So they're outnumbered more than 2 to 1. But Jackson knows a little bit about the British. He had been a young man when the revolution had taken place, and he and his brother, the British occupied their home, and he knew a little bit about how the British functioned. And true to form, the British formed nice, neat rows and marched towards the American forces, who were behind bales of cotton, which absorbed the bullets fairly well because he stacked them nice and deep and thick. Jackson gave direct orders to the people, don't fire at them. In other words, because they couldn't waste their ammunition. They had no way of getting more. They had to just save their ammunition so that they knew it would hit a mark. And he said, don't fire at them until you can see their eyes, which is kind of where we get this saying, don't fire until you can see the whites of their eyes. It came from Andrew Jackson, which is, I didn't mention when I was talking about the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. Sam Houston fought with Andrew Jackson at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. Sam Houston learned a lot of his soldiering from Andrew Jackson. So the Brits were literally mowed down under withering fire, and they just kept marching. They suffered a terrible defeat. That 386 killed, 1,400 wounded, and Jackson became a national hero, which is why you have Jackson Square with Andrew Jackson on his horse in the middle of downtown New Orleans. It's in honor of the fact that he saved the city from the British, because even though the war was over, if the British had marched into New Orleans, they would most likely have torched the place. And so he did still, even though the war was over, he did still save the city from British occupation and destruction. All right, so what are the political, there's long-term effects of the War of 1812, which have a long-term effect on the growth and the economics of the United States. A lot of the New England Federalists had opposed Madison's war. Obviously, they're from the other party, and so anything that Madison does is going to be negative. Same old thing, same thing as now. If you're from the other party of the president can't do anything right. It doesn't matter what it is. These people met up in Connecticut, and they designed some proposed amendments and even discussed secession yet again. But most people, even in New England, don't like this bunch of people anymore. And the Federalist Party sort of just dies a slow death and fades off into nothingness. No one ever hears from them again after the War of 1812, because people are mostly pretty proud of ourselves, because now we have said to the British, you need to get out. We mean it, and the British did, and so they feel pretty happy with themselves. The War Hawks carried on the traditions of strong centralized government. So even though the Federalists want the strong centralized government, it's not like the War Hawks are saying, oh no, only states' rights. The War Hawks carry on the tradition of strong centralized government. They favor Western expansion and quick development of an independent economy and a very strong military, because now everyone can see that it is in no one's interest to cut spending on the military, that you have to keep a strong military, that we're going to have to defend ourselves against people. And so from this point forward, that question is pretty much settled for a long, long time to come. And the last bullet point is very important. Americans have become less dependent on Europe for finished products, and they begin to develop their own manufacturing base. First, because of the Embargo Act, and then during the war, obviously, we're not trading with them, with the British specifically. But it's hard to trade with anybody when you're at war. And so Americans now start developing their own factories, and they start inventing their own things, which we're going to talk a lot about later on. And this is very, very important, one of the most important effects of the War of 1812. And of course, Native American resistance is completely put down between the Appalachians and the Mississippi River. It's pretty much a safe space now for white settlement in that area. Also, there's a building of transportation system. Remember I said there's no roads. Well, we're going to talk later on about something called the American system, which is a Henry Clay idea, which was a good idea. And it was a funding of the building of roads and canals and east-west transportation to get people over the mountains and to connect the east with the west. You can see a little map there on the right-hand side that it's just, I know it's hard to look at because it's small, but it shows you kind of what they were trying to do. They're trying to link up now the east with the west and not just rely on rivers. And because the war is so expensive, it leads to a second national bank. And, we have problems with Hamilton and his bank, and it caused all kinds of issues. And now we're going to have a second national bank, and there's going to be problems with this one too. But people felt like there was a need for it. And the British agreed to no more impressment of sailors, and so that becomes makes it easy for us now to ship around the world. We're no longer afraid to do it. People are no longer afraid to put their men out at sea and have them participate in shipping. And so that's a good thing. And Americans become very patriotic and proud of themselves. Jackson becomes a national hero and like a rock star. Everywhere he goes, throngs of people crowd around him. If he goes from one city to another, they hold big parades to honor him. Because everyone, newspapers are out. There's such thing as newspapers. And everyone knows what he did at the Battle of New Orleans. Everyone knows about the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. and he's a very successful general. And so this war and his success are what you can think of as what kind of make him president later on. What happens to him in this war.